Goedenavond, good evening. Voor de Engelstalige mensen die hier zijn, ga ik onmiddellijk naar het Engels overschakelen. Don't worry, I will immediately switch to English. Just welcoming the Flemish guests, who I hope all understand English, because otherwise they will have a slight problem. Certainly with the slight accent that Mr. Bowman, being an Ulsterman, is having. Very welcome to our new series of seminars co-organized with primarily the University of Kent, and I'll give the floor to Mark Connolly immediately, but also with the support of the Western Front Association and St. George's Memorial Church. How often have we held these seminars? It's the 8th series?
Yeah, it is. That's right.
Yeah, it's already the 8th series. And just as former years, there will be one over here in 2 weeks, one in Canterbury, where usually we take a scholar from here over to Canterbury, and so on. And those who haven't received the mailing, on the website of the Flanders Fields Museum, you can see the whole list and all the dates set. Also something new this year is that for the 4 seminars in Ypres, Mark will be over every time, and he will now explain the reason why.
Yes,
Mark,
thank you very much. Yes, and as Timothy said, we're really pleased with the enthusiastic support we're receiving from the Friends of St. George's Memorial Church for this series. And after each of the Thursday talks on the next day, on the Friday morning at 10:30, I will be leading tours of St. George's Memorial Church. So if you're in Ypres or around and would like to join those tours, they're entirely free. Please come along. We're just going to meet in the church porch at 10:30, and it'd be absolutely lovely to see as many of you, friends, family, whoever, want to come along to have a tour and explore that incredible, unique site within the city of Ypres. So it'd be lovely to see as many of you as want to come along, and as many times as you want to come along as well. You might think, heard it once, can't be repeated. You might think to yourself, heard it once, can't face going back to that Connolly fella. That's the end of that. But it'd be absolutely wonderful to see you. Do feel free to come along. Thank you.
It starts tomorrow.
And it starts tomorrow, yes, thank you for that reminder. So tomorrow morning, 10:30 will be the first of those tours and talks. Thank you.
And so the other thing I have to do is introduce our speaker of tonight, which is Tim Bowman, who's a reader in military history at the University of Kent, specialized in First World War, British Army, and those from Northern Ireland. Am I right in expressing
Some might say Ireland as a whole rather than simply Northern Ireland, but...
it's up to you to explain that later on. I once had the chance of being taken around by Tim in the Museum of Ulster.
Yes, Ulster Museum, yeah.
Which was especially a special treat. Fond memories. Yeah,
good.
Also of the pub we visited afterwards.
Yes, that was the more notable bit, perhaps.
It was a total experience, I would say. But part of this total experience, which Tim is able to offer you, we'll be able to experience tonight. So Tim, just give you the
Great, thanks very much. Thanks for the warm introduction, and welcome. A great pleasure to be with you this evening, ladies and gentlemen, on what's otherwise a fairly cold November evening. You'll possibly work out from the accent that I'm originally from Bangor in County Down, just outside Belfast. Good, somebody knows what I'm talking about. But of course, my accent has been hopelessly anglicised through living in Canterbury for 18 years, so it may manage to confuse my entire audience. When I looked through my notes, I realised that I'd given a talk here, which I think was in either a first or second series back in 2015, where I talked generally about Ireland and the First World War. So I thought when Mark asked me to come back, I'd talk more about the commemorative aspects. And in terms of what I've worked on more broadly, the most recent book, and you know, Christmas is coming, ideal stocking filler, paperback, is A Disparity of Sacrifice, which I wrote with a former colleague, William Butler, who's now at the National Archives of the UK, and Michael Wheatley, and that's all about Irish recruitment to the British Armed Forces in the First World War. So I've worked on the sort of recruitment side in rather more detail than commemoration, so hopefully I'll be able to bring something to both of them. I also wondered where I should start with this, because I was doing various things with the BBC during the centenary of the Great War. Mark and I were both seconded to different regions of the BBC, so I was with the ones in Northern Ireland. So we had Larry Lamb, does that name mean anything? EastEnders, Triangle. He came over to Northern Ireland to show you his, and we were told about his great interest in Ireland in the First World War. The great interest was then revealed when he said, well, what did the government of the Irish Republic do during the First World War? To which, of course, the answer is there wasn't one. So maybe I'd sort of start with a few of the sort of basics of where we find ourselves in Ireland on the outbreak of war, and what that then means in terms of what's being commemorated and how it's being commemorated. So Ireland as a unit then is part of the United Kingdom on the outbreak of war, and returns about 100 MPs to the Westminster Parliament in London. Of those MPs, about 80 are from the Irish Parliamentary Party, who are pushing for Home Rule, which is essentially at that time a form of devolved government within the United Kingdom. So it's not full independence, it's still maintaining that British connection. The other 20, most from what later becomes Northern Ireland, are unionists who are simply insisting on maintaining the connection and being ruled directly from Westminster. So they're not pushing for their own government in Belfast, they're pushing to maintain the link with Westminster. So that then means that on the outbreak of war, you have these two different political blocs which have become increasingly militant over 1913 and 1914. So Unionists form the Ulster Volunteer Force in January 1913, and this becomes an armed body which is there to preserve the Union. On the outbreak of war, it has about 100,000 members who are training part-time. And the other is the Irish National Volunteers, who come together from September 1913, about 180,000 of them on the outbreak of war, and they again are training part-time and are there to try and enforce a Home Rule settlement. So that's the sort of politics on the outbreak of war. When war breaks out then, there is quite a lot of negotiation that goes on between the British government and these two groups. Partly this is to do with recruitment. When the British government first tries to form the new armies in Ireland, there's a 10th Irish Division, which is the Irish element. And elsewhere in Britain, there is something of a rush to the colours. Historians debate the timing of it, but there's something of a rush to the colours. But this doesn't really happen in the same way in Dublin, to the extent that there are advertisements that appear in the Dublin newspapers which say that Lord Kitchener is displeased that insufficient numbers of Irishmen have come forward. So that then is the basis for a sort of botched temporary political settlement which comes in mid-September 1914. And that is that Home Rule, so the idea of devolved government for Ireland as a whole, will be placed on the statute book, so it will become law, but it will not take effect until the end of the war, and special provisions will be made for Ulster and for unionists within Ulster. So that's then the context for the two political groups in Ireland to respond to that. And the response by unionists is really from the very start that they are supportive of the British war effort, and Edward Carson, who's their leader, gives a number of recruiting talks where he makes a few comments that are particularly noteworthy perhaps. One is to say that if the empire goes down, we go down. So the idea that there was no point worrying about partition, what the arrangements would be within the United Kingdom if Germany won the war. The other thing he says is that England's difficulty will not be Ulster's opportunity. And that's to do with an old Fenian mantra from the 1860s about England's difficulty being Ireland's opportunity. So that's what he's talking about there. So the Ulster Unionists have lengthy negotiations with the British government, but start to form the 36th Ulster Division in September 1914. And that then comes to be seen as a very politicised division within the British Army, that this is then seen as Ulster Unionism in arms. Now, if you read the Disparity of Sacrifice, of course, you'll see that there are various issues within that in rural Ulster, Unionists aren't really that keen to enlist. There's a lot of mistrust about what the British government will do while Unionists are serving in the army. So this idea of it being entirely sort of Ulster Unionist is somewhat problematic. For nationalists, of whom William Redmond is one, the first side I'll talk about in some detail. William Redmond's brother John Redmond is the leader of the Irish Parliamentary Party that supports Home Rule. And what John Redmond says on the eve of the outbreak of war is that the Irish National Volunteers can be trusted to defend Ireland, so that the British garrison can be removed from Ireland, it can go off to France and Belgium, and home defence can be looked after by the Irish National Volunteers with the Ulster Volunteers. Later on, as you go into September, October, particularly into November actually, then there is the idea of forming the 16th Irish Division as an expression of the Irish National Volunteers. So the idea of it as being a home rule division. Now that's quite difficult really. In a number of areas, response is lukewarm. You do get formed recruitment in West Belfast, in Derry City and in Fermanagh, so all within Northern Ireland, partly as nationalists don't want to be seen to be outdone by unionists in their support for the war effort. So that's part of what goes on there. Nationalists then do end up with their division, but not with quite the enthusiasm of unionists, not as quickly, not with the numbers, so that all becomes a little problematic. Both of these divisions are out in France by the end of 1915, so after a lengthy training programme they're out in France then. And when we're thinking about the area we're in today, a lot of this comes together to do with the later peace process in Northern Ireland, because there is the idea that if you've got Unionists and Nationalists serving together within the British Army, then this can be seen as a template of what can then be done later on within Ireland. There are various problems with this. By the time the 16th Irish and 36th Ulster Divisions are serving here in 1917, a lot of the men in them are conscripts from England, so they're actually not reflective of these Irish political entities at all. Some are regular soldiers that are generally seen as apolitical, so that's another aspect to it. And there's also a sort of concern about really how well these groups get on together. There are any number of myths we could talk about with Ireland in the First World War, and one that relates very much to Redmond's grave is this sort of myth of comradeship. So what Redmond himself talks about is the idea of bringing together Protestants and Catholics, those from Northern Ireland, those from Southern Ireland, and that by bringing them together within the British Army, that will be a template that then after the war will lead to a proper settlement of the Irish question. But Redmond himself is quite an odd character to be pushing that, because Redmond was seen as being on the more extreme wing of the Home Rule Party. He had had some quite intemperate rows with Ulster Unionists in the House of Commons, including grabbing the mace in the House of Commons and whirling it round his head. Very unparliamentary behaviour for anyone to carry out. So as a sort of, conciliatory figure, one that was able to reconcile these groups, he's not perhaps the most obvious one, though he does later build up pretty good relationships with Unionist officers in the 36th Ulster Division. What is driving Redmond are various ideas, as well as this idea about bringing Irishmen together. There's certainly concern about what's going on in Belgium. His niece is a nun here on the outbreak of war, when the Irish community of nuns has to flee Belgium to do with the German invasion. They then go off and set up their convent in Galway, so there's quite a sort of close family connection with matters that are occurring here. There's also the thought that what Redmond is looking for, and some others, is to sort of push the government further on agenda for Irish independence, that instead of simply getting devolved government within the United Kingdom, that they would end up with dominion status. So it would be seen in the same way as Canada or Australia or New Zealand, and would have much more authority as a government. So that's something else that Redmond seems to be thinking of. But actually in the posthumous book that is published by Trench Pictures from France, which draws on photography, speeches and writings during the war, and is compiled by his wife. What his wife says there is that it was the first Zeppelin raid on England which determined Willie Redmond to join the British Army. So it's actually something that isn't directly linked to Ireland in that sense. And of course we get that in terms of when he's commissioned. They're able to recommission Willie Redmond because he had served briefly in the part-time militia between 1881 and 1882. So 30 plus years on, that is seen as enough experience to recommission him immediately as a captain. But that doesn't happen until February 1915. So it's not an original immediate rush to the colours. There's quite a lot goes on before that. He's posted to the 6th Royal Irish Regiment, which is 16th Irish Division. And shortly after the Battle of the Somme, he speaks to one of the captains from the Ulster Division, which gives you a better idea, I think, of what his vision is. And this is to Captain W.T. Collier. And what Redmond says is, "I do want to see a united Ireland. As you know, there is a big gulf between South and North, between Catholic and Protestant. Catholic as I am, I want that gulf to be bridged over, and I believe it can be. I have worked for it all my life. Out here is a golden opportunity. Here we have two whole divisions, the 16th Irish Division, representing the Catholic, and the 36th Ulster Division. At present, these two divisions are kept severely apart, on the traditional assumption that they would fight each other like wildcats if they came into contact. Well, I am exerting the utmost political pressure to bring them together, because I believe they would do no such thing if they were fighting side by side against a common foe. It would be the first step towards the ideal. Then, well, if only I could get amongst these Irish lads in the trenches, if only I could see for myself Ulster shaking hands with County Cork, I should feel that I had not striven in vain." So that's a sort of idea if this is a sort of reconciliation gesture. It's fair to say that Redmond is, from what we can work out, perfectly sincere in this view. There is sort of a problem about how far this actually goes. There's certainly evidence that those in the 16th Irish Division and 36th Ulster Division, on the occasions when they met, which weren't that common, even when they're brought together in the same sector, they're in different rest villages and towns behind the lines when they're out of the frontline trenches. So when that all happens, there are a few incidents that make you wonder. There is a great example given by Roland Fielding, who is a Catholic English officer who's commanding the 6th Connaught Rangers, where he says that there's a football match being played between his battalion and a battalion of the Ulster Division, and he says wags in the crowd say, "Is this consorting with the enemy, sir?" So the idea that this is all a wonderful reconciliation on the Western Front is a little bit tricky. And of course some of the things that Redmond is talking about here had come up in recruitment in Belfast when Joe Devlin, one of Willie Redmond's fellow nationalist MPs, had stood on recruiting platforms and said to Belfast nationalists that they should stand by the democracy in Britain because the democracy in Britain had stood with them to give them home rule. The unionist press in Belfast had a field day. saying that no such agreement had been made, that the whole idea of what was going to happen in Ireland in terms of home rule, in terms of treatment for Ulster, would be settled after the war, and that the IPP were quite wrong to be making these promises. So the idea of reconciliation is there. How far it gets in the First World War is debatable. I'll say more about how it's used later on in the 1980s when I come to talk about the Island of Ireland Peace Park shortly. Redmond then is shunted into what Terence Denman, his biographer, talks about as an ill-defined staff job, which is all to do with boosting morale. You can see from this that he is getting on a bit, to put it bluntly, in terms of trench warfare, and the thought is that he should be kept out of the front lines. Redmond himself could have had a nice, safe, comfortable job back in Ireland, simply organising recruiting meetings there, but says that he wants to serve at the front. And then, to do with the Battle of Messines, Battle of Messines, on the 7th of June, he is determined that he will take part in the attack. This then puts the commanding officer of the 6th Royal Irish Regiment in a very difficult position. Lieutenant Colonel Edmund Roach Kelly, 30 years Redmond's junior, is then being asked by Redmond, can he please attack with the battalion. What the commanding officer decides eventually is that Redmond can go into action with them, but as part of the third wave. So it's hoped that after the mines are let off, after the intensive artillery preparation, that the advance will go forward with minimal casualties, and that kept back in the third line, then Redmond will be relatively safe. However, that doesn't work to plan. By 3:30 a.m. Redmond had been wounded by shrapnel, by artillery fire, but his men left him and carried on with the attack, thinking that he was only slightly wounded. He was then found by Private John Meek of the 11th Royal Enniskillen Fusiliers, and this again is one of these sort of great stories of reconciliation, where he was a convinced unionist, by some accounts a member of the Orange Order, particularly extreme sort of Protestant organisation, and he then seeks help. He's unable to move Redmond himself because Meek is slightly wounded, but he goes and seeks help and gets a stretcher party who are from the 36th Ulster Division. Redmond was still conscious when he was brought to the aid post and spoke to the Anglican chaplain there and asked him to write to his wife, but he died quite soon after that. The family story that I have about this, which is from my great-grandfather who was serving with the field ambulance, was that the surgeon had said that Redmond had effectively died of a heart attack, and that a younger man would have survived, that it was basically the sort of stress and the loss of blood that had led to his death, that a younger man would have managed amongst that. So how true that is, I'm not entirely sure, but that's one version anyway. And if we're thinking of where that sits within the experience of his battalion, the 6th Royal Irish Regiment, you can again say that he's fairly unlucky in that the battalion had lost 3 other officers and 27 other ranks killed, and 4 officers and 68 other ranks wounded. They sound horrific enough figures, but of course by First World War standards, that's an acceptable level of losses, as it's seen by the High Command. What then happens with Redmond is that we end up with a very elaborate grave while the war itself is going on. This is the gravestone today that many of you might be familiar with over at Locker. And this is the grave being visited in September 1917 by men of the 16th Irish and 36th Ulster Division. So again, the idea of bridging the political divide in his death. The Redmond's body is collected by an ambulance from the 16th Irish Division late on the 7th of June, and he's then buried in a coffin, which is a very unusual experience for any British soldier in the First World War. Is buried in a coffin on the 8th of June with a guard of honour which is drawn from the 2nd Royal Irish Regiment, who are from the 16th Irish Division, and from the 10th Royal Enniskillen Fusiliers that are from the 36th Ulster Division. So again, the sort of politics of that should impress us. Now this then of course creates considerable problems for the British War Office when they're trying to work out ideas of repatriation, or rather non-repatriation for bodies after the war. And indeed, Redmond's grave becomes a very well visited site during the war itself. In the temporary exhibition here that's now running, there are the visitors' books to Redmond's grave, and you can see there in 1917 very large numbers of soldiers go to visit it. A large number of them are from the Australian Infantry Force and from the Canadian Expeditionary Force, so his death resonates outside Ireland. These are presumably second, third, fourth generation Irish, but it certainly says that this is talking to a wider sort of British Empire constituency, simply rather than simply an Irish one. So this arrangement with the grave there is that the grave will be looked after by the nuns at Locker. So that's the arrangement that the family seem happy enough. Redmond's wife Eleanor is perfectly happy with that. And his nephew, William Archer, Redmond MP, who was a major in the Irish Guards, he also wanted the body to be left where it was, or to be returned to Wexford for burial. So the idea of it being concentrated into a wider cemetery was not something that his nephew was very keen on. There's then an exceptional circumstance made by the Belgian government, where the Belgian Minister of War says that this can sit as an isolated grave by itself, a very unusual dispensation to be given out. And Eleanor herself then, Redmond's wife, pays for this memorial stone to be put up at some point in the 1920s. So a very simple stone, which then has it's a marker behind it now, which is a more religious symbol, which is linked in there, but the cemetery itself, Locker Cemetery, sits off to the side, so it does sit very much by itself. The situation then remains with this sort of strange anomaly up till this day, of course, that this grave sits by itself outside a wider concentrated cemetery. But there's a lot of concern about this over the 20th century, what might be done about it. In 1956, the grave is visited by a tour group from the Royal Ulster Rifles Association. Now that in itself is interesting, because the Royal Ulster Rifles was recruited largely from Belfast, Antrim and down, so from Northern Ireland, would be seen probably as sort of unionist in a political sense. But they wrote to the Irish Independent newspaper in Dublin saying that the grave was almost lost in long grass and was sadly neglected, and that the British government, the Imperial Commonwealth War Graves Commission, as in Commonwealth by that stage, Commonwealth War Graves Commission, should really be looking after it more effectively. In 1958 then, the nuns left the hospice at Locker, so there's no sort of local group there to look after it, and the Commonwealth War Graves Commission agreed to maintain the grass path up to the grave, so that they would maintain the site in that way. That's not a situation that's seen as entirely satisfactory to the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. And in 1967, after quite a bit of difficulty, they tracked down Redmond's two grandnephews. And it says something that the sort of leading nationalist political family in Ireland from the 1914-18 period is then so much forgotten. In 1918, the old Home Rule Party had essentially been wiped out in the general election. They were down to just 6 MPs, with Sinn Féin, the much more radical nationalist group, many would say Republican group, that wanted a republic, Irish Republic, established, overwhelms them. So it's interesting how much the Redmonds are sort of forgotten as you get into the 1960s. The agreement then that the Commonwealth War Graves Commission gets from the family is that this grave and the body should be moved into Locker Cemetery, and there is indeed room in the cemetery that is marked out for the body, but this of course doesn't happen. What it leads to is not quite a political storm, but certainly a lot of concerns and outcry. In Locker itself, the outcry is led by the local parish priest, an 83-year-old, who says that the locals have looked after the grave and will continue to look after the grave, that this is not something that the War Graves Commission ever needs to worry about. There's also some concern back in Ireland about how this should work out. The chairman of the Royal Irish Regiment Old Comrades Association writes into the Irish Times and essentially supports the view of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, saying Redmond's life was devoted to the unification of his people. Why should he now be separated from his comrades who fought with him to achieve this? But there are different views. Dennis Gwynn, who had written a biography of John Redmond, Willie's elder brother, called for what he simply termed an Irish response, that the Irish government really had to say something about this and do something about this grave. And Brigadier General Dorman O'Gan, who had served as Chief of Staff to Claude Auchinleck in the Middle East during the Second World War, then got very much involved with extreme nationalist politics, trained the IRA, all sorts of strange political moves there. He writes in the papers opposing the movement of Redmond's body, so there's enough sort of political reaction there for the body to be left essentially where it was. This was then reinforced by Belgian politicians in June 1967, 50th anniversary of Redmond's death. There was a very impressive service at the grave attended by Belgian politicians, veterans of the 16th Irish Division. And at that, the soldiers' song, the national anthem of the Republic of Ireland, was sung. So that's an interesting political development there too. Amongst all that then, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission decided to leave things as they were, to leave this grave isolated. Now the paperwork on all this, I can give you a flavour of some of it. There we have, which is basically, this is some of the very early correspondence where the concerns are about, will the Belgian government allow this very strange exception? Probably not. Concerns about the family and concerns about where this leaves the British government's policy of concentrating bodies and not repatriating them. So you get a flavour of that in some of the early correspondence. Concerns too about what his widow thought, issues about how she would go and visit the grave and so on. This is then writing personally to one of the officers that's involved in grave registration about how this can be dealt with, how it's an awkward case, and so on. And then the British Legion getting involved with concerns there. This is a 1956 letter, which is to do with how they're saying that the grave isn't being particularly well treated and something needs to change. So this is all correspondence in the Commonwealth War Graves Commission files, which Mark Connolly very kindly photographed for me. The sort of result of all that is that legally the Commonwealth War Graves Commission takes the view that they have the right to move the body if they want to. They have the family permission, but they decide not to. So that's sort of where we're left in that, in a very technical legal sense. What locals would think is perhaps something rather different. What would be said in the Irish press is perhaps something rather different. So that I've talked about first because we have people visiting the grave from 1917. What I want to turn to now is the Munster Cross. I was rather surprised to see that in the recent redevelopment of the area, the Munster Cross has moved a little bit. Still being maintained wonderfully well, but its site's slightly different. So this is a photograph from several years ago, which shows it in the position it was then. The Munster Cross is quite an interesting development in that it's not really linked to the British Army in any sense, and it's very much localised. Maybe get a better sense from that. So it's the Irish Ex-Servicemen's Association in Cork that are involved in putting the Munster Cross together. And you'll see that while many of them have served in the Royal Munster Fusiliers, there's no regimental badge of that British Army regiment, and the crowns that they have here are the ancient Irish crowns of the province of Ulster. province of Munster, one of the 4 historic provinces. So it's not a British crown. So it's an interesting view of how they're sort of negotiating things within the 1920s. We can see that it's in memory of those men of Munster who died fighting for freedom, a phrase that was often used by IRA veterans about their campaign against the British in 1919 to 1921. The cross itself, it's designed and sculpted by O'Connell's of Cork, which is a firm that specialises in religious memorials. It doesn't have any particular links with the British Army and no particular links with Ypres. And it's unveiled, one of the earliest ones to be unveiled in Ypres on the 7th of July 1924. So at a time when most of the city is still in ruins, this is being erected in the middle of it. And this leads to quite an impressive ceremony with the local council in attendance. And there's also a representative there of the Irish Free State government. So what you've had after the First World War is War of Independence, which ends up with Northern Ireland, the 6 counties in the northeast that are run as a devolved region of the United Kingdom, responsible still to Westminster, but with their own parliament, which sits in Belfast. And you have what's now the Republic of Ireland, which back then was known as the Irish Free State and was a dominion of the British Empire, the same sort of status as South Africa or Canada as it was back then. So where this sits is quite an interesting one. Then we're not getting any British imperial imagery, we're not getting any statements about the British Army. And one of the representatives from the Irish government attends this, and this is also interesting because this is the very early days of the Irish Free State, and they haven't really built up a diplomatic service properly, so to have any government representative at an event overseas was seen as really quite an event. There's also perhaps other things going on with regard to the Royal Munster Fusiliers. The largest regimental memorial for the Royal Munster Fusiliers is at Ypres and is to do with the retreat from Mons. So it may be that that's very much linked to the 2nd Battalion, which was a pre-war regular regiment. So this may well be more the sort of wartime volunteers' response to that they didn't think they should be lumped in with the regulars in that way. And with the unveiling ceremony in July 1924, 170 members of the Cork branch of the Irish Ex-Servicemen's Association were on parade. Quite an impressive number when we think of the logistics of getting from Cork to Ypres at that time. And the reports in the press were that the city was gaily decorated, so flags and bunting, which again seems quite incredible amongst the ruins of the city. The delegation from Cork was led by Lieutenant General Sir Brian Mahon. And this again seems quite an odd choice because Mahon had commanded the 10th Irish Division at Gallipoli and isn't really connected that much with the battles on the Western Front. But this group that comes over with Mahon is greeted by the Mayor and the Town Council of Ypres and entertained at a civic reception, so that they get very warm hospitality there. And the representative of the Irish Free State is Count Gerald O'Kelly, who comes from Brussels for the occasion. His post is a slightly awkward one. He's essentially the honorary ambassador in Brussels. There isn't a proper diplomatic service for the Irish Free State at this stage, but he's as close as you get to an ambassador. Some of the speeches then threw up some rather interesting ideas. Sir Brian Mahon said that Irishmen had been proud to help France and Belgium to defeat the tyrant who threatened the freedom of Europe, and spoke of the historic Irish link through the Irish nuns who had lived in Ypres for almost 300 years before being forced to flee by the Germans in 1914. So again, no great imagery about the British Empire or service to the British Army. Gerald O'Kelly, the Irish ambassador de facto, spoke of the 300,000 Irishmen who fought, as he put it, for the Allied cause. So again, not specifically British Army. He goes on to say that they were all volunteers, that there hadn't been conscription in Ireland, so this had showed quite a lot of support for Belgium there. And then went on to say that their rallying cry had been "Avenge Belgium, avenge Louvain." So linking it very much to a Catholic response to the war. I should of course say that O'Kelly's figures are rather wide of the mark. The best estimates we've come up with are that about 200,000 Irishmen serve in the British Army. You can of course play games about third, fourth, fifth generation Irish in the Canadian forces, in the United States Army, in the Australian forces. There's all sorts of games can be played there, but actually men recruited from Ireland is closer to 200,000. On this great unveiling then, the burgomaster of Ypres then spoke and congratulated the Irish people on attaining their long fought for freedom. And he spoke of a myth that when the Irish nuns left Ypres, then Ireland would be free. So this doesn't sound to be terribly conciliatory to any British imperial representatives that are there. Wreaths are then laid on the base of the cross here. The photograph here shows a poppy wreath, but there's none of those, it seems, on this occasion. The Cork branch of the Irish Ex-Servicemen's Association lays a wreath of white lilies, which in an Irish sense is interesting because they're connected more with the rebels that take part in the Easter Rising in Dublin in 1916. So again, the lily is an odd situation there. And the motto on it was, "To the memory of those who died for liberty." So again, nothing of a British connection there. There's then a ceremony goes on and includes members of the Cork Ancient Order of Hibernians, which is a political organisation that had been very much linked to the Irish Parliamentary Party. They laid a wreath with the motto, "In affectionate remembrance of the men of Munster who died in freedom's cause." So these issues of freedom, liberty are writ large. After the unveiling here, the group from Cork then go to Willie Redmond's grave. So these two things are tied up quite neatly on the unveiling day. I'll now sort of fast forward a bit to one of the later memorials. I'm not sure if we've got any Irish speakers in the audience. I wasn't going to inflict Flemish on you. I'll not inflict Irish. If we move on to the End of Ireland Peace Park, I'm sure familiar to many in the audience. This is in some ways a rather odd endeavour, and of course the more recent troubles break out in Northern Ireland in 1969, and they reach their worst intensity in 1972. What do you say about that? Sectarian pogroms, tit-for-tat murders, this drags on and on. So where I was brought up in Bangor and County Down, there are no great stories for you, I'm afraid, of Bowman's War. My students are always very disappointed about that. I say that really talking about the mean cul-de-sacs of Bangor doesn't really give them a flavour of things much. But there are obviously different political voices trying to bring some sort of settlement to the Northern Ireland problem. Some would say things came fairly close in 1974, where there's what's called the Sunningdale Agreement, which leads to moderate nationalists and unionists working together in a power-sharing executive, so again devolved government, with the British government retaining responsibility for security matters, so for the police and for the army. That falls apart relatively quickly, and it's not until 1998 that you then get another agreement that brings some sort of settlement. I'm not sure the term peace settlement is really the best one to use given what's happening at the minute. Some have said it's an agreement that leads to an absence of war in Northern Ireland, which might be the better way to place it. Where all this sits within it is quite a sort of odd endeavour, which is inspired very much by Paddy Hart, who's a TD for Donegal, who I think is a very sincere politician. That's not something you'll hear anybody living in England talk about very much these days, sincere politicians. And he is a representative for Donegal. Now, if you think of your map of Ireland, this will confuse you. Donegal is the most northern county within the island of Ireland, and is, of course, in the south. It's part of the Republic of Ireland. So it's not part of Northern Ireland, it's part of the historic province of Ulster in the far north. So basically, Paddy Hart is representing constituents who live on the border with Northern Ireland, and they're thinking about what might be done to lead to reconciliation. So what Hart comes up with after meetings with various politicians in Ireland is supported very much by county councillors in Donegal, and manages to bridge the gap to speak to some Ulster loyalists, so the very sort of hardline unionist element that is involved in sectarian killing. He comes up with this project, and what we have there is a model of based on a traditional Irish round tower. The classic that's maybe thought of that links to it best, that's still intact, is an 8th century tower in Glendalough in County Wicklow, about 20 miles outside Dublin. So that's what many people would think of when they look at that. There's further symbolism in it that perhaps isn't so obvious from the photograph. It's 32 metres high, 1 metre for each county in Ireland, the 32 counties north and south. And the funding for it comes from £150,000 provided by the Irish government. So what you can see this as is an attempt by the Irish government to reach out to the more extreme elements of unionism rather than dealing with the centre ground. Quite an odd endeavour in its own way. This is then dedicated in quite an impressive ceremony on the 11th of November 1998, in a ceremony that's attended by Queen Elizabeth II, King Albert II of the Belgians, and President Mary McAleese. And some have said that this laid the groundwork for a lot more of the elements of the peace process, particularly Queen Elizabeth II's visit to the Republic of Ireland and her meeting with Martin McGuinness, which was seen as a very important bridge building exercise. When I was giving a talk at the National Archives during the centenary of the First World War, President McAleese was present at that, and became rather agitated that people didn't seem to be talking enough about this. She saw this as one of the great achievements of her presidency, which some rather cruelly said showed how little had been achieved under her presidency. Certainly, where it sits is awkward, and I think that for somebody from my background, particularly middle of the road Alliance voter from Northern Ireland, elements of this do look very odd, and I think there are a number of problems with it. We have a peace pledge, and this is the only thing that's read out on the day that it's unveiled, so that the heads of state don't say anything beyond this pledge. And parts of this do look rather odd to some of us. As Protestants and Catholics, well, for a start, that assumes that everybody's from one of the two tribes. We apologise for the terrible deeds we have done to each other and ask forgiveness. Most of us came to the conclusion we hadn't carried out any terrible deeds against anybody much, and that this was a rather odd way to go about it. Glenn Barr, who is one of the loyalists that's involved in this project, is very keen to talk about how this is bridge building and so on. Many at the time said, well, if he hadn't done his most to wreck the Sunningdale settlement in 1974, perhaps we would have been spared another 24 years of the Troubles. And that great statesman, Seamus Mallon, from the moderate Social and Democratic Labour Party, said that the 98 agreement that comes together was Sunningdale for slow learners, which I think is a very apt phrase about what was going on. So this is quite odd. It doesn't really make the appeal that you would think it would. A lot of those in the middle ground don't see anything here that's being said to them. Many indeed were of the view that the Loyalist paramilitaries were involved in a very cynical exercise. I've said that I think Paddy Hart was a man of honour and integrity. I think a lot of the Loyalist paramilitaries were basically looking for a settlement that would release their members from prison rather rather than create anything that would be a lasting peace deal. So I think that's what comes in behind a lot of it. So, as somebody from middle of the road background in Northern Ireland, there's problems. There are others that I think are an issue here as well. There is quite an odd idea here of sort of mobilising the dead in favour of a particular political settlement, which none of them would have recognised. Or indeed it's playing into the idea of Willie Redmond and Irish nationalists in 1914-15 and onwards, that somehow Unionists would come to recognise that a Home Rule settlement was in their best interests, and this would all work out. So that's an issue, I think. Where the site is, of course, is also in its own way problematic. It sits in an area where the New Zealand division fought. So it doesn't actually show you anything about where any of the Irish units were in the Ypres Salient, so that's quite problematic. There's also the rather difficult question of, well, what is this for? You can get into the ground level, which provides shelter for, I think we've managed to cram about 16 of our students into it. But there's no facilities, which of course can be important on the Western Front. And the only things that are meant to be there for people to look at or read are Ireland's memorial records, which were a series of 8 bound volumes that were put together just after the Great War, but are seen by most historians as very problematic. Lots of men are in it who were English, Scottish, Welsh, but conscripted into Irish regiments. A number of things come up after 1921, so it's vastly inferior to the likes of the Commonwealth War Graves database, or the database the museum here has, in terms of trying to work out who actually served. So that's a problem in its own way. The building is impressive in its own right, but there are sort of a few problems with that. Some thought that all this stonework looked so much better when it was Mullingar Workhouse, which was meant to be a Grade 2 listed building, but was demolished overnight to provide the stone for this. So there's a little bit of a problem here about doing away with a genuine piece of heritage to create a faux piece of heritage. That should concern those of us who have an interest in the built environment. And then, of course, a lot of those that work on this project are involved in what's called the youth training programme in Northern Ireland. Now, the idea of that was that they took I think they're all young men who are unemployed, to teach them valuable skills that would then find them work. And a number of them come from Derry. It's an equal group of Protestants and Catholics that come. There are perhaps some stories, some of you know, about what they got up to in the evenings with too much Belgian beer being readily on tap for their constitutions. But the fundamental problem with that, some would say, is that there isn't much demand for 8th century round towers anymore, so teaching these guys to build one didn't really lead to much. And of course, if you look at the stonework on this, it does match what you've got in Glendalough, but it is very crude stonework. It's not the sort of fine work that we see by master masons and the like of building we're in today, that there's an awful lot of mortar in it. This is not the sort of thing that you would want a modern building or restoration of most historic monuments done as. So that is a major problem as well. If we think about the politics of it, you can see the sort of sense of this in the early 90s perhaps. The idea of bringing people from Ireland to what was seen as a neutral space. Another small country in Europe where Catholics and Protestants get on reasonably well. I'm not quite sure that my Belgian audience is going to agree that the Flames and Walloons live together as one big happy family, but certainly from the Irish perspective, it was seen that was some sort of model that Ireland should follow. But as you go on into the 1990s, a lot of that reconciliation becomes possible in Ireland itself. So there's no need to go out and commemorate the Irish dead here. From the 1990s. What we indeed see is that in 2002, the first Sinn Féin Lord Mayor of Belfast, Alex Maskey, made a point of laying a wreath at the Cenotaph in Belfast. Now that's carefully choreographed. It's done an hour before the 11 o'clock ceremony organised by the British Legion. It's with white lilies rather than red poppies, but still it does show that the recognition is there for those who served in the Great War, whether they were from Unionist or Nationalist backgrounds. And the final thing to say about this is that the money that comes from the Irish government is sort of a one-off payment to build the tower. There's no real thought about how it's meant to be sustained, maintained, and what's meant to go on at it. So there's a lot of complaints very soon after it's unveiled. As early as May 1999, we get a letter to the Irish Independent from Jim Hunston. He was a school teacher from Surrey who had brought a group of his students over to the Ypres Salient. And he wrote saying that 95% of the trees were dead, the grass was knee-high, and the book of condolence was missing. Continuing, on reflection, the occasion, the dedication on 11th November 1998, was drowned in a sea of self-congratulatory claptrap and empty political rhetoric and hyperbole. That's not much praise. The story was, of course, that things were so rushed to get it ready for the heads of state visit that the trees were planted with their roots still in the plastic bags. And then the poor things obviously die. So that was a particularly grim aspect. What I thought I'd finish with, I'd started with an individual, I thought I'd end with one, is to do with Francis Ledwidge's memorial. Sang. And Ledwidge is an Irish poet, often talked about as one of the peasant poets, and he died on active service in 1917, aged 30. He had worked for a number of years as a labourer, but he had become politically involved and was a member of the Meath Labour Union, so trade union activist, a member of the Rural District Council, so local council, local government. His politics was deemed to be more advanced than the politics of Redmond, so he's seen as a more extreme nationalist and socialist than anywhere we would put Redmond in the mix. But he does decide to enlist on the outbreak of war. From what we can work out, a lot of that is driven by his patron, Lord Dunsany. Dunsany is recalled to the army and goes into the 5th Royal Enniskillen Fusiliers, and Ledwidge then goes in 24th October 1914, so again not a rush to the colours, some sort of considered thought about how this would work. He later justified joining the British Army by saying that it stood between Ireland and an enemy common to their civilisation. And he said that he preferred that course to staying at home passing resolutions against the war, so he thought it was important that there was some active engagement. But politically he becomes very disillusioned by this Easter Rising. Some of his personal friends were involved in it. I'll come to that again more properly in a moment. And his military career, he had originally served out in Gallipoli and Serbia, had been wounded, was back in Britain recovering when the Easter Rising takes place, then gets sent out here and is killed basically on road repair work by long-range artillery on the 31st of July 1917, so in what seemed to be a sort of behind-the-lines situation. Now, there's a lot of interest in Britain in the war poets, and indeed lots of my students, when they come to university, their understanding of the First World War, which leads Professor Cullen and I to rip what's left of our hair out, tends to come from poetry rather than from a proper study of history. So I think partly Ledwidge is rediscovered within that side, but he's also seen as very influential on a later generation of Irish poets, because a lot of what he talks about is the natural world, and this influences Seamus Heaney amongst others. I can give you a flavour of some of his poems, which gives you an idea of this. I won't read them all out, but one of his poems, it's called War, so you think this is as warlike as it gets. That reads, "Darkness and I are one, and wind and nagging thunder, brothers all. My mother was a storm. I call and shorten your way with speed to me. I am love and hate and the terrible mind of vicious gods, but more am I am the pride in the lover's eye, I am the epic of the sea." So again, quite a lot about the natural world there, and certainly nothing about the circumstances of the Great War itself. His other poem that's particularly well known is to do with his friend Thomas MacDonagh, who is one of those who is executed by the British after the Easter Rising. So again, that looks a bit odd that with somebody serving as a soldier in the Easter Rising evoking concern for one of the rebels. The first verse of that is, he shall not hear the bittern cry in the wild sky where he is lain, nor the voices of the sweeter birds above the wailing of the rain. So again, lots about the natural world there. So hopefully this evening I've given you some flavour of some of the major Irish memorials. There are many more, of course. St George's Church has a window to the South Irish Horse in it, and of course the graveyards are representative of the Irish loss in the Great War, so you're never that far from it as you walk around the battlefields of the Ypres Salient. But I thought that those ones were particularly interesting in terms of the understanding of how the experience of the First World War was seen as something that could be used to reconcile Ireland during the First World War itself, and how that then is rediscovered in the 1990s and put into similar use, even though in both cases it rather plays about with some of the historical understandings and the political intentions of those in Ireland. Thanks very much. I'll end it there.
Okay, Tim, thank you for this interesting thought-provoking talk. Two things I would like to add, because they're timely. The Munster Cross, the centenary of the Munster Cross is coming on, and in April we will have a delegation from the county and city of Cork over to commemorate together the fact that the Munster Cross is there 100 years. And then also, well, you briefly talked about the exhibition Forevermore, and one of the, in my view, more important parts in Forevermore is that I wanted to show how commemorating war, in our case through the centuries, maybe through memorials, is always somewhat political. It's always ideologically influenced.
Yes.
And I was instrumental in having put the Island of Ireland Peace Park on the UNESCO World Heritage List as a member of the scientific committee who prepared it. Even if there was some criticism from other people in the committee on the fact that it was a rather new memorial and with that political purpose, but in my view, it didn't make a lot of difference with many other memorials who were there much longer.
Yes.
So on the contrary, I thought it a very interesting thing to have this added to it. However, the question I have relates to both the Island of Ireland Memorial Park and Ledwidge. And it's something that has always puzzled me ever since 1998, and that is when you enter the Island of Ireland Peace Park, you've got these slabs to your right with quotes and also one poem of Ledwidge's soliloquy, his last poem. And I always wondered why the last line has been omitted at the Island of Ireland Peace Park, because the last line of that poem changes the whole meaning of the poem. Because the poem ends like, I hope I got it right now, a little grave that has no name is greater than a poet's fame, a little grave that has no name. That's how it ends at the Island of Ireland.
Yes.
But then the last sentence actually is, whence honor turns away in shame.
Okay,
and I've always wondered, and I do not know whether you have an idea why they've omitted. Was it on purpose or not? I can hardly believe that it was not on purpose. Why it's missing from the Island of Ireland Peace Park?
Well, thanks for that, Dominic. That's what you say, isn't it? It's something for me to look into, is the honest answer. I don't know if that... does that stake... I suppose there are problems with questions about who you then honour which is more obvious with the Ledwidge bit. You know, do you then say, well, okay, there is a grave or a memorial, but we'll have something additional to it? I'm not sure about the peace part. The sense that I had from what little I've been able to work out about it is that the money seemed to run out and everything was being done in quite a rush at the end. So I wonder, there is just the possibility, there might have just been the possibility there. And then some of the material that there is quite odd. There are strange quotes from papers that are in the Imperial War Museum that aren't really in any sort of great context. So it may have been ideas about taking a certain number of words rather than trying to reflect entire chunks of text. Certainly something to think about, but yes, I think there might be some practical issues there rather than anything particularly ideological.
A couple of times I was inclined to go with a marker. And
yes, add it in, yes.
And the second question I have before I give word to the floor is, this wasn't there, I mean, there has always been a sympathy in Flanders and especially among Flemish nationalists for the Irish cause. And
yes.
is that something that you also see reflected in the records, for instance, in the National Archives? Is there some concern on the British side or from the Belgian side mentioning this, it to be instrumentalized or not by, for instance, the Front Party, who was then the Flemish Nationalist Party? Or?
They don't seem to have great concerns about that. The concerns seem to be the sort of local parish priest who's saying that, you know, they will look after the grave. So it seems a very, very practical issue. There doesn't seem to be any concern that this would blow up as a wider issue about sort of political independence and the Belgian politicians would get involved in that way. I mean, something I should say is that there's a tendency to think that, you know, poor little Catholic Belgium is only something that Irish Catholics talk about. But during the Great War, you have quite a lot of recruitment platforms for the Ulster Division, where a lot is made about Belgium as well, and the treatment of civilians by the Germans. And actually the connections in a commercial sense are more to do with Unionist Ulster before the war to do with the linen trade. So one of the older things that you can look at in the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland is the letter book of J.M. Andrews and Company, a linen firm in Cumber in County Down, where the letters are going out to their agent in I think it's Ostend, saying, well, you know, contract, that would be the major element of it, yes, that would be it. Saying, you know, when are we going to be able to ship the flax over again? When is this trouble going to pass? Can you get insurance to get the flax sent over? So that sort of concern is not really as sort of politically partisan as it sometimes seems. So the British government doesn't seem to have any great concerns in that sense. And it doesn't really flare up in the papers beyond some letters into the papers. There's no great editorials that sort of get engaged in ideas about Belgium and Ireland and where that relationship might be going in terms of independence. So it doesn't seem to last that much beyond the war itself, strangely. Good. Questions have we got? No, stunned into silence.
Mark, Tim, I was wondering, with the Munster Cross,
yes,
does that become a site where it's easier for people from Cork to come here to Ypres to remember the war than it is to remember it at home? Do you know what I mean? That you have to get yourself out of the city and the county in order to commemorate, because it's just smoother and easier thing to do.
Yes, that would be an obvious situation to think of, because Cork is known in the Irish War of Independence as Rebel Cork, the highest British casualties outside Dublin are seen in Cork. But actually the Irish Ex-Servicemen's Association has a memorial put up in the main parade in Cork by 1926, and the pictures of that are of, you know, crowds of 300-400 of them on parade with big crowds. So again, that sort of idea that you had to export your commemoration to make it safer isn't actually the case. There's still quite large Protestant communities in Cork as you go into the 1920s, and Catholics that have been in the Royal Munster Fusiliers are quite happy to join this Irish Ex-Servicemen's Association, which then obviously sits aside from the British Legion. So there is a sort of politics of that. So that would be a logical thing to think, but it doesn't seem to have been the case. Yes, right, yeah.
So excuse my ignorance.
Oh, not at all.
But in a simplistic way, I was amazed when you told us that leading up to the outbreak of the First World War, I think you said there were 100,000 gathered in the militia up in the north.
Yes, the Ulster Volunteers.
180,000 in the south.
Nice.
So, to my mind, or is this just a silly thought? Had the First World War not come along, would that, I mean, or put it another way, with the First World War come along, did that prevent those two sides a year later clashing as a civil war?
Probably it did. And indeed, it's very odd how this is taught at schools in Northern Ireland. A lot of how history is taught in Northern Ireland is ideas of education for mutual understanding. And what you get there then is a rather odd view that, well, wasn't it great that Catholics and Protestants could both enlist and go over to Europe and kill Germans because that brought them together and meant they weren't killing each other? And often that was being pushed by those who were also very keen advocates of the European Union. So you thought, where does that leave the great European project if you're saying that this was better than having a civil war? Certainly things were running into the ground as you got up to the First World War. There had been extensive gun running by the Ulster Volunteers. They had brought in about 50,000 rifles in April 1914. The army at the Curragh camp, a number of army officers from the British Army had said that basically they wouldn't do anything to disarm the Ulster Volunteers if they received orders to do so. And the King had called a conference, the Buckingham Palace conference, for which no proper minutes are kept, which is frustrating. But they hadn't been able to reach an agreement there. The thought is that what was being suggested was partition, something a bit like the 1920 settlement, but that doesn't come together. So all the signs were that things were moving towards some outbreak of violence in late 1914 if something didn't turn up. What turned up was the First World War. So that is certainly a way to see it, yeah. Others?
Can you say anything about the Black and Tans?
I can say quite a bit about the Black and Tans. There's a new book out a relatively new book out by David Leeson. Now, the Black and Tans, it's a cover name for two different groups. So when the War of Independence breaks out in Ireland, that's a sign really that things have gone badly wrong with the Royal Irish Constabulary. The Royal Irish Constabulary is there to sort of uphold British rule, but is largely made up of Irish Catholics. Fairly large numbers of them resign in that scenario, and the Royal Irish Constabulary itself had lost a lot of its most able police officers because of the war. 50 inspectors had been called up as army captains. About 1,000 had gone into the army as reservists, so that had all been depleted. So what the British government does is turns to ex-servicemen in Britain to provide recruits. Black and Tans are enlisted, the sort of proper term is Black and Tans that are enlisted simply as police constables, who are there on the understanding it'll be a full-time career, that they'll go in as Irish policemen, and when they defeat the IRA, they'll be there 30 years and get their pensions. The other group that's sometimes covered by them is the so-called auxiliary division, and these are largely ex-officers. They're formed up into specialist, basically infantry companies. One of Winston Churchill's ideas, they're sort of a special force that then means the British Army doesn't have to get that involved with the Troubles. They're the ones that are responsible for some of the worst atrocities. The burning of Cork is one that you're possibly thinking of. But if you're looking at these men, there's a very humorous take on this. It's probably not something to be humorous about, which is a song which is The Gentle Black and Tan, which is how these men are misunderstood and how they all have shell shock and have been put into this scenario with without any training. That's to take it to one extreme. Certainly the work by Leeson shows that most of these men have pretty distinguished war records. The IRA line was that they were the sweepings of British prisons. Most are actually good war records. A number of the officers had won military crosses, for example. But they're not trained for counterinsurgency. Trench warfare does not produce the right response, and the British government allows what are basically official reprisals against Irish towns and villages, and the city of Cork are the most notable, so it's a particularly grim example. So the Irish War of Independence in many quarters would still be called the Tan War, or the Black and Tan War. Yes. Any other?
And how about Irish soldiers who served in the British Army in the First World War? They were pretty well blacklisted, weren't they, after the war?
Sorry, what was that?
Getting a job.
Those who served in the British Army. That's another interesting one. One historian, Jane Leonard, will tell you that they're very much victim groups by the IRA, that they're particularly targeted in that sense. Others will tell you that because you get the Soldiers, Sailors and Air Force Land Trust in Ireland, which builds quite a lot of homes in Dublin, Belfast, Cork, and that the army pension is set at GB rates rather than Irish rates, that actually they're financially better off than some of their counterparts in Great Britain. So there's sort of very different views about the sort of regional aspects of that. And the new Northern Ireland government reserves a number of jobs in the civil service for ex-servicemen. So there are sort of very different experiences there, it seems. A big proportion, of course, don't go back to Ireland. That's the other bit. They find jobs in Britain or jobs in Europe, yeah. Good enough, thanks.
Okay. If there are no further questions, we'll wrap it up here,
Yep.
but not
Thanks.
without making some publicity, first of all. And by the way, do you have Photoshop on your computer?
No, I don't think so.
At first I was thinking that this was the French flag.
No. A trick of the light,
Yeah, just some announcements. The next seminar in our series is in January, however. Next week we also have an interesting event going on, which is the book launch. Well, the book has been launched, but book presentation of Reclaiming the Salient, Resurrecting the Battlegrounds by Roger Stewart, who's a local Brit and a local guide. And it's partly, well, the book has two parts. One is on the problem of unexploded ammunition, and the other part is on how here in Belgium we deal and have dealt with when human remains are found. Two questions that he, as a guide, was often asked, and so he decided to write quite a good book on the subject. And then, so our next seminar, 18th of January 2024, is Amy Harrison on pilgrimage and tourism along the Western Front. You might have noticed that if you look through the titles of the seminars and the events going on, they're all linked with the exhibition Forevermore and the idea of commemoration and so on. And then the final thing I would like to do is to ask a last firm applause for
thanks.
And important, if you would like to attend the book launch next week, because of some practical problems, it will be in the Vries House, the meat hall, opposite the cloth hall, not in our usual Hound, the museum cafe hall.
Okay.